Okay. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. We're starting right on time. Thank you all for coming. It's great to have you here. So welcome. I know there are a lot of competing events. You could be in many other spaces, and so I really appreciate that you've come here. What we're going to talk about today is food systems opportunities to deliver low emissions, climate resilient development strategies. So we've been working, and when I say we, this is the Mitigate Plus initiative from one CGIAR. And we have a nice panel with us today to talk about the work we've been doing with countries on developing long-term strategies for low emissions and climate resilience. So thank you all for being here. I want to introduce the speaker and panelists, and then we'll start out with a presentation from our speaker online, and then we'll shift to a panel discussion around the topic. So online, we have Vivian Umulisa, who is a climate change mitigation specialist with FAO. She'll be talking to us about the work she's been doing with partners to develop guidance for low emissions development strategies. This is work we're doing in conjunction with the Africa Group of Negotiators Expert Support and other CG partners and national partners as well. So we'll hear from her on that work to develop that guidance. And then we'll have a panel of quite a range of speakers, which I'm very happy about. So we have Freddie Kabango, who is the Assistant Commissioner for Soil and Water Conservation with the Ugandan Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industries and Fisheries. We'll also have Caroline Mwangera with us, who is from the Alliance of Biodiversity and International. She's a theme leader for the ICRA program. ICRA stands for Accelerating Impacts of CGIAR Climate Research in Africa. We also have Owen Hewitt with us, who is Chief Technical Officer for the Gold Standard Foundation. And finally, we have Sheikh Mbao with us, who is the Director General of the Center for Suvi Ecology. Thank you. That one was difficult for me. So we'll start out with Vivian. We want to hear from you, your contribution to this. We look forward to it, and we hope that the sound is good and that the internet will hold. So over to you, Vivian.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vivian Umulisa, as Laura introduced me. I'm a climate change mitigation specialist for the FAO, and I'm very pleased to join you today in this discussion on this very important topic. I'm going to be talking about guidance for low emission development strategies, and particularly focusing on how to support countries in strengthening the alignment of these long-term strategies as they are developing with the existing NDCs, NAPs, and also sustainable development goals. As a background, as Laura mentioned, for the last year, we've been collaborating with AGNES, African Group of Negotiators, ICRA, and Alliance for Biodiversity, for developing, for supporting countries in developing their long-term strategies by compiling guidance and tools and different materials to support them as they are going through this process. So I'm going to be talking in this presentation about the preliminary results of this guidance, which includes the important processes and key steps that countries need to put in place to meet the LTS development requirements, the key elements that are incorporated in the long-term strategies, and how to strengthen the alignment of long-term strategies with NAPs and NDCs based on the country experiences, and also the main key lessons learned from the African countries that we've been working with. So as a background, as you know, Paris parties were invited to submit their mid-century LTS by 2020. And by now, only 55 countries have submitted their LTS to the UNFCCC, and these include only 6 African countries, including Benin, Gambia, South Africa, Tunisia, Nigeria, and Morocco. However, in the updated NDCs, we see from the FAO report, we see that 69% countries included a long-term vision for mitigation, and this is in comparison with the 13% in previous NDCs, and also in these NDCs, countries included in long-term adaptation plans. So this shows that countries are moving toward developing their long-term strategies, even though few have already submitted them. And many countries are at different stages of submitting these reports. So there's need for guidance on the structure, on the elements, what are the performance indicators for these LTS, and also the methodology to comply with the ETF, the same as NGCs. So this guidance is based on countries' experiences. This is the approach that we took through the interview with national technical experts, analysis of submitted LTS when they are submitted, and also country gaps, capacity needs expressed in long-term capacity, in LTS capacity needs workshop that was led by Agnes and the FAO and the other organization, as we stated. So as you can see, most of the countries are from Africa, including Nigeria, Rwanda, Ethiopia, South Africa, but also we have few examples of the other countries outside Africa, like Cambodia and Costa Rica. So from these experiences, I want to highlight some of the key the consideration and criteria for developing long-term strategies, and some of the prerequisites that was gathered through this work. So first, I think one of the main key points that came out is how the development of these strategies depend on the high-level political support, and this is, for example, the case of Nigeria, where the High Office support these or initiate the development of these strategies. Also, the coalition, encouraging the coalition building within the civil society to support the LTS vision is a key step that promote these the kickoff of these strategies. Also, the institutional arrangement, which is the case with similar to NDCs and NAPs, is also a key step to enhance the coordination. And first step throughout the developed LTS, so the ongoing processes, is to decide the leading institution that is leading this activity, and also map existing institutional arrangements for the development of LTS, or develop new institution arrangement if necessary. And also one other aspect that was put forward is ensuring that the Ministry of Finance and Planning play a central role in this process. There is also the need for political coherence and the integration of LTS with national development imperatives. On this one, many countries have existing long-term plans, and so there's a need to ensure that these long-term plans are the basis for the LTS development.
Apologies for the technical difficulties. We are working on it.
Stakeholders in the LTS development, and also ensure that stakeholders are informed about the process. Another key aspect of this process includes
Vivian, we're having some trouble hearing you. Maybe you can
implementation.
Go ahead, continue.
Okay, thank you. There is also to have the means and decision support tools required to meet the challenges of lack of data where the data is not available. To identify global and regional partnership and cooperation that offer technical support, and this include there are some organizations already that are putting forward this, moving forward this effort, like NDC partnership, like the collaboration that I talked about for and Agnes and CGIAR. Building technical expertise at FAO, we've been developing different tools like the NDC expert tool that assess the impact of mitigation, long-term mitigation action on a long-term frame, but there's a need to strengthen this technical expertise within the country, and also to conduct a gap analysis and consultative needs assessment. The financial capacity need as well, and this includes both inclusion of long-term financial and investment vision in countries' LTS that could be used to facilitate its implementation, and also to build on financial needs assessment conducted for the NDC NAPs. So these also form the alignment through the same financial channels. And based on these, the LTS that are being developed and the ones that are submitted, these are the key elements that are being put forward in long-term strategies. They define the scope, the coverage, and the targets. Some are in the African context. Most of the LTS being developed are the agriculture sector to be incorporated in the economy-wide. The greenhouse gases reduction potential mitigation action and their costs, description of the methodology also in LTS are being put forward, description of legal and institutional framework, the target goal for mitigation and for development, and also implementation and management plan for the LTS, and the plan for monitoring and reporting. And based on the experiences that have been gathered through this work, these are the ideas for aligning or effort in aligning NDCs and NAPs and SDGs through aligning intermediate targets. For example, the 25 targets of NDC with the long-term strategy and NAP, and aligning the monitoring and the evaluation system to select and to evaluate the impact of short-term indicators, assigning NDC NAP actions to the rated SDGs to make sure that the long-term strategy is responding to the priority SDGs in the country, setting up common or coordinated institutional arrangements. This has been proved to offer important good results in aligning these processes, and also linking the monitoring system for NDC and LTS and coordinating review and revision cycle of the two. So in regards, this is the last slide on the lesson learned from the African countries. We've seen that in the African context, the focus on developing the agriculture LTS is a key transformational step into a national low carbon economy. And we've seen that the success of LTS development depends on how synergized the national and subnational actions are in a manner that avoid duplication and conflict and enhance policy coherence. We've seen that a wide consultation, collaboration between ministries, departments, agents, as well as private sector, academia, researchers, civil society is a key to enhance the prioritization of the mitigation and adaptation actions, and also their validation, as well as to facilitate data collection and sharing to put forward the LTS development. We also seen that the investment in data collection is an important step, and this has been, for example, the example of Ghana, which gathered a good data of agriculture data of different aspects. It was has been helpful in different aspects of reporting on GHG inventories and also on pushing the LTS development. I think these are the main lessons, and this effort is ongoing, and we look forward to more to the discussion and to more input from the panel on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian. That was great. We really appreciate it. We're just going through a little stage change right now, and we'll have our panelists come up and join us. So I'd like to invite up on stage Mr. Freddie Kabango from Uganda, Dr. Caroline Mwangera, Mr. Owen Hewlett, and Dr. Shekham Bao. Please join us up on stage. I'd like to sit too. Yeah. Okay. So we'll just get seated here. One more. I'll come sit with everyone. So we'll start out with some opening remarks from each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and answers and discussion. So I want to turn it over to Freddie first, as we just reorganize a little bit. So Freddie, we heard Vivian talk about the lessons that have been learned from the experiences of working with different countries, and Uganda has been one of those countries. We've been engaged, I've been there, we've had technical team meetings, we've been working on this agriculture LTS for Uganda, and I know it's aligning with the economy-wide LTS. So what I want you to tell us about is what have been your experiences, and what do you think are the lessons that you have learned in terms of aligning these different national policy documents and thinking long term, because these are strategies out to 2050. So what are some of the challenges that you've seen, and how have you managed to bring all these different policies into alignment? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the previous speaker. Actually, on the map, she didn't talk about Uganda. But Uganda is one of those countries which were in blue around the Victoria. I was seeing keenly. So we are one of the countries which is working on the long-term strategy in the agricultural sector. And so some of the lessons which he has actually highlighted have been really touching as far as we are concerned. But in the development of this strategy, there has been a lot of maybe 4 things that it requires a lot of planning. It requires a lot of planning. It requires a lot of coordination, because most of the activities that accrue out of agriculture actually touch other sectors. And even then, at the development of this, the strategy itself, it has to be incorporated into the economy-wide, which is now national. Meaning that we have to work with different sectors and the departments and agencies. So one of the areas which needs to be focused on is, one of the areas that are important really to focus on is coordination among sectors. And also support. She has talked about the political support. That one is very important, because after development of that strategy, you need to carry out investments. So those investments must be given a blessing by our political leaders. So you need a lot of lobbying, you need a lot of working with other people, but also political support. And then also consultations, because here we are, but all beneficiaries are the farmers. Then we have the civil societies. who we need to work together. Leave alone we who work in government, but we want to work with civil societies, farm organizations. In our case in Uganda, we have the farmers, the National Farmer Federation, who are part and parcel of this, and they have a big stake in the economic development of our country. And then the political side, our leaders. Then the academia, and then the national agricultural research organizations, which things she has ably highlighted. So those are some of the things we have actually, and so challenges have been actually earmarked around those: coordination, and then working with different organizations, getting the political support that you need is also important. Sometimes it can be challenging, but you can go around it and get it. And also getting the research organizations together to all agree that all this is what we need. And then finally, to focus it on the economy-wide LTS. It's very important. Otherwise, it remains in isolation. It becomes a sector kind of investment. So I think that's what I can say about that. Thank you.
So much. Thank you so much, Freddie. I want to go to Caroline now. We heard Vivian talk about the integration of science into these long-term strategies. From your experiences, I know you've been working with Senegal quite closely on developing an LTS there. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've been working with them, the kind of support you've been providing, and how that has been going?
Okay, thank you, Laura. So I'll speak about not just Senegal, but also other countries that we've been engaged, supporting them also in the process of starting to develop the LTS. So what we see in terms of science, one of the things that we have seen is really that there's a lot of national capacity. So like specifically for Senegal, the work is the modeling, the climate data is coming from the national institutions. And it's also an approach of also reporting back on the modeling process, because there's been a process to improve the climate modeling, the climate models. So this also is becoming a process where, as an output, the team is also looking at reviewing the models themselves and reviewing the outputs of the model. So we have seen the LTS for us not as a means to the end, but also as a means of building capacity, as a means of also improving, like, for instance, the climate data outputs that can be integrated to other sectors. And one of the other things we've also seen is that, for instance, the same comment Freddie is saying, looking at agriculture in isolation, like if you're doing the modeling, a lot of times you're looking at hotspot mapping, the risks in agriculture, but we have identified that the need for integrated sciences, like for instance, in those same areas where we are looking at agriculture vulnerability, we have underlying aspects that are from other sectors, like from in Senegal, they are strongly using the One Health approach. So we see that as also a critical entry point, where the LTS should also be looking at, yes, it's an agriculture sector LTS, but the science domain should also be trying to incorporate all these other sectors. So I think that for me has been a great example. Of course, Senegal has very strong national capacity, so it's really, really helped in terms of also the data and the analytics capacity. So it's been, because data has been one of the weakest challenges we've seen in many countries, because many countries do not have, what can I say? I want to be politically correct. They do not have, especially, I would say in terms of spatial scale, many African countries have not been collecting data in terms of frequency as well as the quality at a resolution that is high enough to inform decision making and investment. So that's been a big challenge. And for the LTS, finally, what I can say from a science perspective, when we started the work not in other countries, we wanted to use, like, for instance, data that was publicly available from global data sets. And of course, a lot of countries reflected back and felt that it was like we were passing a message that the data in country is not good enough. So we also tried to see how do we bridge that in terms of, we are not saying that we address the data gap by just looking for other sources of data, but we also want to emphasize that country data needs to be there and needs to be available. So how do we get it from where it is? Because the data is sometimes there, but not publicly accessible. So that's been also one of the things we are trying to look from a scientific point of view. How can you make these data sets publicly available in a format that can also be reproducible into many of these policy documents? Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Mbao, do those comments resonate with you from a West African perspective?
Oh, thank you so much. I really hear you, what you're saying about Senegal. I would be very interested to learn more. I'm from Senegal, by the way. Let's try to put this in context. We are talking about low emission in a context of Africa where smallholder farming are the dominant system. That's number one. Number two, we are talking about low emission strategy in the context where Africa import food by $35 billion a year. We are net importer of food. So emissions related to poor people cannot be voided from one day to another. Let's be very honest with us. Agriculture in Africa would be extremely difficult to decarbonize because of the poor systems, the poor equipment, and the practices of agriculture that the smallholder farmers are going through. It will be also very difficult to cancel all the emissions related to trade. When you import $35,000 of food every year worth, the trade emissions, the manufacturing, all the things that goes along the value chain in relationship to food security would have a big carbon credit, a big carbon footprint at the end of the day. So what Centre de Suivi Écologique is doing is exactly what my colleagues are saying. Because that's one suggestion I will make to the panel here. The LTS you are talking about will join another LTS. The other LTS is a long-term survey. The long-term strategy should join the long-term survey. We need data. We need information. You cannot manage or measure something you can't measure. And the data is so important then it would be worse to do an appeal that all national policies in terms of food security include the issue of data and calibration of what we do. So what CSA is doing is exactly that. We're using Earth observations to monitor the size of the fields. We're doing it with a survey program. We're doing it with GMS activity. We're doing it with a national food security program. So a lot of data are generated, and you can see with that data that the government is able to target, because you can't just decarbonize without knowing where the highest emissions are. You can target where you can go, and you can just leverage the opportunities in each of the sector. The second point where data is important is the issue of risk. We are in drylands. You know, every 5 years we have a drought or a flooding. There's high exposure and loss and damages.
Recording in progress.
We have a lot of issues related to pests and diseases for the plants, and all those things require urgencies and modeling and preparedness. Data is absolutely playing a key role in addressing the issues of urgencies and the matter of urgencies. And I will skim over a few other things which might be interesting for this group. When we talk about agriculture, let's take it as with its wider signification and include livestock in that. The livestock system is based on mobility in Africa, particularly in the Sahel. And you all know that it's associated with a lot of bushfires. So decarbonization, biomass destocking, and a lot of impediments for low carbon processes. And addressing those require a bottom-up approach. We can't just do it with an intellectual mindset, with a top-level political process. We need to work with communities. The responses to low carbon emissions in Africa starts with communities. And second point is the perspective of being long-term. Most of the projects that we have here are short-term. They are ad hoc projects, 3 years, integrated approach. We want to plant trees, we want to improve yield, but after 3 years, the funding is gone, and we need a long-term decarbonization. It will never happen. It's like this mythological believing of Sisyphus, where you're climbing a mountain and the ball rolls down and you climb again. That's what we're exactly living in when it comes to decarbonization. But there are some hopes, some good news with the ecological transition happening in most African countries, particularly in Senegal. Transition écologique fait partie de la politique environnementale. It's one of the key aspects of the political environmental policy in Senegal is ecological transition. Because Africa started doing ecological transition before the name of the term has been created. Our ancestors had been having this integrated approach. The same piece of land was serving for the livestock, for wood, for water. Everything was integrated. The monoculture system that comes with colonial system has to specialize the landscape for production. So there are lessons that needs to be learned from the practice, the old-time practice from our practitioners. But we're doing ecological transition as well on the energy and sustainable energy processes, using solar energy, solar pumping to do not only agricultural production, to use water, drip irrigation, but also to transform food product to serve the growing market issue. So the ecological side of it, I'll wait for the discussion to say. There's a lot to say on land restoration, on land degradation neutrality, to say about the Great Green Wall and many other initiatives that are happening in Africa that can pave the way for the long-term strategy for low carbon emission. This is just an introduction, some few ideas to share with you.
Thank you so much. I want to pick up on what you were talking about data, and I also want to bring back what Vivian was talking about in terms of involving not just government, not just research, but the private sector. So Owen, can you tell us what you've been doing with the gold standard and how it can feed in here?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I think in terms of the private sector, we've done a lot of work in different forms of voluntary finance. So where regulation doesn't necessarily exist, a lot of private sector actors looking to take responsibility for their emissions and their other effects. And the way we frame that responsibility, if you like, is we need the private sector to take responsibility for its own emissions, so to abate its own footprints, and we need the private sector to take responsibility for what's left over for its residual emissions. And so you'll hear a lot about the voluntary carbon markets and voluntary offsetting in the latter especially. But it was interesting what Caroline said about we need to not just look at agriculture. I think in the voluntary space, we're even more minute than that. We'll look at a specific activity type within a specific crop type within agriculture and try to maximize that. And that's a huge wasted opportunity. So we have a private sector, I think it's fair to say, post COP26, and it seems like COP27 as well, that has pledged heavily to join the race to net zero and beyond. But it works in isolation. It isn't currently well connected to Paris. It isn't currently well connected to the LTS work, I'm guessing, that everybody's talked about here. And it needs to be. And I think maybe one particular example to illustrate, when I think of the voluntary carbon markets and voluntary offsetting, the way that works is an activity type will be identified. Maybe it's reduced or improved tillage with producers, and the market will get good at that, and it will scale that particular action. And it will deliver some carbon credits, and those carbon credits will be bought by somebody, and hopefully producers will get paid for it, hopefully more efficiently than they do now, but let's imagine that they do. But is that useful? Is that connected to an LTS? Is that the right way to decarbonize a sector? And so we need to move from a fairly self-centered view of private action, or voluntary action, which is, I want to become net zero as a company, or I want to become carbon neutral by offsetting, to one where the private sector contributes to global net zero, contributes to country level net zero, and contributes to sectoral net zero. And I think second to that, we need to not be siloed between the emission side of stuff and some of the other sustainable development goals and resilience. So there's little efficiency in decarbonizing a value chain that can't operate in 10 or 20 years' time because of climate reasons. So these things have to go in lockstep. A lot of the action that happens through voluntary emissions-related finance can be stretched to already includes things like resilience. So we need less siloed thinking between the private sector and everything else, and we need less siloed thinking between the emissions and other sustainable development goals. And I think that's possible. We know from our work at Gold Standard that there is alignment between voluntary and Paris. I'm speaking at an event tomorrow exactly on that topic. And also then looking to create science-aligned sectoral pathways. So how can we look at a specific sector and know what we need to do?
Great, thank you. I have many questions I think I could follow up on, but I want to give time to the audience to also contribute and ask and participate. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. If not, I will start asking questions. But anyone with questions for the panel or contributions from your experience? Go ahead.
Hi. Okay, yeah, you can hear me, I guess. It was very interesting when you started talking about the data and the need for disaggregated data. And I was wondering, when it comes to indigenous knowledge, how do you evaluate the data and how do you bring those data into the speech?
I don't know who wants to take that one. Dr. Mbao, do you want to take?
That's a very important question, and that branched me into an appeal which I've been doing many years. IPCC is doing a great job, but the science in those technical reports and high-level publication does not always respond to the bottom-up approach which I mentioned for communities. I think we need a blended approach. The long-term implementation comes with a long-term strategy, and the implementation cannot be just something that stays with intellectuals and researchers. You need to get the local communities to bring their knowledge, to co-design and co-implement things, and we need to find a standardized way, along with a normalized way, to bring the local knowledge, the indigenous knowledge into practice. Most of the solutions that we are dealing with are already known by local communities. We just need the framework and the possibility to scale them out from one village to another, from one community to another. That's a very great point, and I think it could be one of the strongest recommendations in here, particularly when we deal with vulnerable communities, poor communities, who knows their landscape and the different challenges that they have in the local areas.
Thank you for the question. And actually, one of the guiding principles in this strategy we are trying to develop is inclusiveness, which takes care of indigenous knowledge and responses of indigenous communities. It's very important. And we've made it a principle, one of the guiding principles. So as he has already said, inclusiveness within that context of having indigenous knowledge alongside the technical knowledge or scientific knowledge, we think is very important, and we find a point where they meet and be able to implement. So we have made it a point that it is one of the guiding principles to ensure or to make sure that it is very important in this aspect of the long-term strategy. Thank you.
Other questions from the audience? Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Alex Awiti from World Agroforestry. My question really is how these discussions are framed in the context of wider systems development, from an economic development. I come from Africa, evidently, and over 75% of populations in Africa are rural, dependent on subsistence, food system production and all of that. That is land-based, extremely constrained, low input systems, low productivity. And these conversations around food systems transformation specifically implicate significantly the livelihood options for farmers. Now the question is, across the food systems, value chains from production to transportation to consumption and all of that, there's opportunities to deliver low climate emission resilient strategies. But who's willing to invest at the farm level to basically start the whole process of ecological intensification that actually reduces potentially on the development curve the need to get to fertilizer application rates that we see in the West that are extremely detrimental to the climate system, biodiversity and all of that. So the question is, how do we position this broad of transitional development strategies that are inclusive and pursue a just transition system that brings farmers in the tight lens of development conversations, not just food production, overall economic development trajectories for these smallholder farmers in a transitional conversation. Thanks.
I think I want to ask Caroline to address that one.
Okay. So maybe I can give an example what I've seen happening, which is donor driven. And one of the ways, because what we've seen is that, of course, these are very long-term plans. And what has been missing is how do you bring the key decision-making that can also support short-term decision-making and contribute to the shifts that you need to look at low-emission development across the food systems, and also not only the challenge for Africa, also the shift to also remove people out of poverty and food insecurity. So those two also become critical. It's not just about a low-emission development pathway, but also about the need for jobs, food security, and also looking at vulnerability. So what I've seen as one of the ways that this is being addressed, and it's happening in a few countries in East Africa, is that there's a very strong demand to take those documents and really go to take a holistic approach. So the holistic approach looks at all the sectors, integrating finance, integrating markets, looking at how can you develop an investment roadmap. So how can you translate this long-term document, looking at the gap and financing needs, looking at developing an investment roadmap that looks at the matchmaking. So this is recently that has been completed for Ethiopia and Rwanda. And Ethiopia actually has a very strong government-led process where they're even very specific on which value chains. And like Ethiopia right now is very serious about what they are going to do in the wheat value chain. And they have specifically wanted to see this unlocked in terms of what's identifying, not how do they make sure they're transitioning to, for wheat, for example, driving productivity, driving agriculture risk management solutions into the sector, looking at also as one of the outputs, the number of people that these investments are going to reach, but also looking at a climate resilient development process for that. So I would give that as one of the examples that I've seen, like really trying to be very practical in the implementation. And Rwanda is also the same. They've also been doing that. And it's happening at very low levels. So the data analysis and the modeling and all this stakeholder engagement happens at sub-regional levels. So they don't want the national level, because LTSs tend to be it's national level. It's a national level document, but just going to really make sure it's holistic and it's granular. So you're going to really sub-regional level. So that could be one of the examples I can give.
Thanks, Caroline. I see another hand in the back.
Thank you. Is it on? Yep, okay. Hello, Karen Hogan-Gazera from Canada. Working on a project with, I think, leading from the question about how do we move systems holistically into low emission strategies like in North America. And sitting next to me is Michelle Nutting from Nutrien, who is one of the larger fertilizer and distribution companies in the world. In Canada, we developed a 4R nutrient stewardship framework, and that framework involves governments and industry and advisors and training for extension specialists on the ground who work with the farmers in Canada and the US to be able to bring the principles of the right rate, time, source, and product. Thank you, Michelle. And it's no different in terms of the extension of that in Africa or the extension in Canada. So working with Global Affairs Canada, there was a grant given to I'm just going to read from the document here, the Canadian Cooperative Association and Fertilizer Canada, working in 3 countries, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Senegal, bringing in that framework that works in Canada into those countries, working with government, working with extension specialists who would, can mobilize with tools that are simple to bring how do you apply the right rate, the right product, the right time, and the right place to minimize nitrous oxide emissions in the applications of nutrients. It's obviously going to be different institutional arrangements, but those 3 countries, they're deploying that framework on the ground and using basically the same kind of assistance that are working with Canadian farmers with the African farmers in smallholding there. So if you're interested in any more information, happy to share.
Thank you. Does anyone on the panel want to respond to that?
Yeah, only just to say, I think what comes across all of that is there's pretty 4 scale levels, if you like. We've got a kind of global supply chain view. So what do we do with the soy or the wheat or the cacao sector? You've got an LTS view at national level or an even regional level, and then you've got the corporate level, corporate engagement, and then you've got the communities. And somehow there is a disengagement across those things. They're all, I think, all saying the same things need to happen, all saying we have the same data challenges, all saying there are these barriers to investment, but ultimately there's still a disconnect there. And I think what we're starting to see with these conversations and what Karen just pointed out is, once you have a blueprint of how to bring all that together, once you have a sectoral decarbonisation and resilience plan, once you have the LTSs, then you can start to overlay them with each other. And then with the private sector, we can move from, well, I feel like doing this in this place and then I'll claim the benefit for it, to this will be credible if I participate in this larger movement. So we need to shift this kind of mindset from, I know what decarbonizes, so I'm going to go and buy that and I'll just, I'll stop worrying about it, to they would be really nice if we could click into this bigger picture and that would be the thing that was legitimate. Because I think ultimately on the private sector side, the motivator, apart from things like reputation and regulation, is to do things legitimately. And so we've legitimized this very siloed thinking, I think, historically in voluntary action. And if we can somehow reverse that and click it back into how do we bring those 4 scales together in a plan, then you'll have something powerful.
I want to add a scale into there. We've talked a little bit about, Dr. Mbao mentioned the cross-border issues and mobility, and this morning I was talking with Freddie about that, and you were telling me, Freddie, about a Kampala declaration that has just been made about mobility around climate change issues. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and does that have a place within these long-term strategies, these cross-border issues?
Thank you. Thank you. There was a lot of noise. I didn't actually hear exactly what you want me to talk about. Did you say about mobility and climate change? The Kampala Declaration probably is what you want me to talk about, which I think was talked about by His Excellency, the President of Uganda, yesterday. And he made an appealing approach to all member states and the parties actually to adopt it and integrate it into the UNFCCC so that it can become part and parcel. It's a declaration which was made with IGAD countries just recently in Kampala, and it is called the Kampala Declaration about mobility of communities. But it's all about really having looking at how communities get challenged across boundaries, because in that declaration, there is no boundary. Climate change has no boundary. That was most important, that it will stop here. And there was a moving statement that these boundaries we see today are man-made. But God created the world and there was no boundary. So because it is climate change is nature, and natural in its nature, it cuts across boundaries, irrespective of whether you belong in a certain country or wherever. And mostly challenges are different depending on how prepared communities and governments are to ensure that their communities do not suffer a lot. Their communities are aware, their communities take on adaptation measures and mitigation measures at the same time. So that's what I can talk about, and it is very important that through these UN assemblies, we really look at such issues. And Uganda, from that statement, is one of the countries that has an open kind of approach to all people who come in the country, irrespective of why they come, but they have to be treated with dignity. So that was a very important statement from that Kampala Declaration. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to elaborate on what the Canadian and US. I need to escalate my voice a little bit. There's some competition in the back. So I really like the way you put it. And when you come to Africa, that perspective of heavy investment into low emission options is absolutely very hard to pursue. Often, when you see the low emission options, it requires a lot of investment. Where is this investment is coming from? It does not come from the national budget. It comes from some project, or people will borrow money. The state will borrow money to pursue low emission. So we are paying the death of climate change 2 times. The impact of climate change because of the high emissions coming from developed countries, but also the money to resolve the issues of climate change. We have to borrow that money and pay it back with a rate which is not given. And I think in the whole concept of LTS, we should also make an advocacy about the new financial mechanism that needs to be put in Africa particularly to respond to mitigation, which is an option, while pursuing adaptation, which is an obligation. So there is a semantic reflection, an ontological thinking, philosophical thinking here that goes beyond the technicalities of things. Where do we position the strategic aspect of LTS in Africa as compared to developed countries? Because we don't have the same challenge. The challenge you have is not the financial challenge. Your challenge you have is technical challenge. In Africa, the challenge we have is not technical challenge, it's a social challenge. So we need to really think deep on those issues before we make any recommendation, because we have a differentiated landscape in this very area. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, yes.
I appreciate those words. Originally, there was an application that went into Global Affairs Canada for 5 African countries, but the funding got cut back to $16 million for the 3 African countries to develop this framework. And I hear you, that money is not going to go very far, right, for a long-term strategy. But I think the emphasis is to work locally on the ground with the implementation structures that are there so that that money can, the impact can be felt longer. Will it be successful? I don't know, but we can hope.
Okay. Other questions from the audience? Okay. Am I? Lou? Okay, go ahead.
Oh, always happy to ask a question. So we often hear about the need for systems transformations, right? So, and we need to transform our food systems, our waste systems, our energy systems, our financial systems. we have somebody from finance, we have some people from the government, we have some people from technical services that are supporting this. To what extent are we actually starting to achieve systems level approaches in Africa, and where are the opportunities to do that, and what, more importantly, what are the obstacles? And for the scientists, where can science help overcome the obstacles? The finance, where can the finances help with that? And the governments, where can policy help overcome these obstacles to really taking comprehensive systems level approaches to solving these problems?
Caroline, that's an easy one. Do you want to take that?
Yes. There was a session in the morning that was also talking about the whole question about transformation adaptation, systems transformation, and also reflecting on experiences of our work, our research from a research perspective in Africa. What we are seeing is that we are asking for, fast-paced and rapid shifts, whereas we are seeing what is happening is actually more on the incremental, But for me, what I think is that looking at a system, there's really not like a very clear line when you look at the food systems between, is this transformational or is it incremental? I feel that in the same system, things are happening at different levels in that same system. So my personal view is that we should not be reflecting that we want to see a very transformational change, because in the same space, some things have to happen incrementally, you see? And so, like for instance, if you're looking at the aspect of how we need to change our agricultural systems to be able to cope in the long term, to have these long-term shifts towards climate change adaptation. So how do we make that shift, that transformative shift? Within that transformative shift, some things are incremental. So I think for me, in one system, several things will happen at different levels, and it's asking yourself which points in that system need a transformational shift and which one needs an incremental shift. So my take is that agriculture in Africa, we cannot get out of agriculture and make overnight and go out of agriculture to another system, So we need within that system to have some incremental changes in terms of how we adapt our agriculture system. But maybe we need a transformational shift in our way of how we use technologies in that system. So within the same system, we can have, for me, I feel like it's a take of the two. And I would want to ask Alex, because I know you're a key opinion maker in my country, to also say what he thinks. It's somebody I admire so much, and he speaks a lot about these issues. So I would also want to hear him, what he has to say about it as well.
Lou, good to see you. So I think this is exactly what I was trying to suggest. And I think the huge conundrums, I'll give a very specific example. In Western Kenya, the average income of a 6 to 7 kind of households number is about $466 coming out of agriculture. They live on 0.8 hectares of land. They have 2 animals. They have 13 chickens, and they have 2 goats, for example. And their crop mix is mainly grains, maize, for instance. And then they have small grains like sorghum and millet, for example. So this is the picture that we need to think about. The average income in Kenya is about $1,500 a year. This farm family comes in at $466. A household led by women comes in at $166 per year. So you can see that they have 0.4 acres land less. They probably have no animal in the system. So you talk about agroecological intensification of those systems, you can't even talk about crop livestock integration, tree crops, etc. So how do we transform this? How do we carry these families in this economic development prosperity trajectory? What investment options do they present to somebody looking at investing in rural transformation in Africa, for example? So I think this is really where we need to focus. How do we move them from $466 a year to $1,500, which is more or less, still, it just gets them slightly above the poverty line. But bear in mind that they produce only 800 kilograms of grain per year. They are hungry 120 days in the year. And they are producers of food. So I'm not asking the question, but I'm just trying to make this as clear as possible to all of us as we think about these very complex problems that we're trying to deal with. And this is nested in a very tough environment of poor access to health, poor access to education, low unemployment, broken infrastructure, critical problems with participation in government and voice in decision making. So look at that whole mix. Now that's what we're trying to deal with.
Thank you. I think you made very great point. I want to add two things. The first thing is, if we want to have that level of integration that Lou is mentioning, we need to rethink the national policy for greenhouse gas emissions. The integration that the local farmer, that does differentiate livestock and agriculture. But if you go to the government, you have Ministry of Livestock, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of this and that, and they don't talk each other. There's a level of integration that we need at that top level. The second is the cascade impact of one sector to another. Infrastructure. We don't mention infrastructure when we talk about agriculture. But think of Africa. If there is a food crisis somewhere, the first thing the first aspect you think of is how to condition food from one point to another. The road system, the conservation of the product, and many others. And infrastructure is really affected by climate change with flooding and a lot of things which are happening. So to me, I think we need to create a specific framework for low carbon to integrate our NDCs with different sectoral policies, which is not the case. The NDC in my own country is not fully integrated with the agricultural policy. The agricultural policy will just do not care about mitigation or any of those emissions, while the NDC is recommending activities that go through ad hoc processes of project and small communities never scaled up. So without having that coherence between different policies at national level, the long-term strategy for low emission will be just a dream.
Freddie, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Actually, you have tried to make the narration out of the poverty cycle that a farmer faces. What you are saying is actually a challenge to most of our African leaders. Getting their people out of poverty and predicaments. Climate change inclusive. So, in order to have that holistic approach, the system approach is talking about some of these strategies we are developing are now hinged to the economy-wide long-term strategy, which now looks at all sectors and their contribution and how they can help the local people. The Kenya, you say wanaichi, isn't it? The wanaichi. How the local person can now have a feel of government intervention in this. And that is how it goes, to look at the system from sectors to economy-wide kind of approach. What can you do? For example, when we look at food systems, we see that there is production, but also processing the food, transportation, and make it available to the farmer's table. All those processes that it goes through may not be handled by one sector. It is a number of sectors. So what does it mean that when we look at the economy-wide long-term strategy, we look at all those sectors and how they can come in to help the local person? overcome the predicament. And by so doing, that's when you can have a holistic kind of approach. Of course, in our strategy, for example, we have a number of actions we have earmarked in our strategy. It is in the making, but we are looking at all those kind of predicaments which farmers face. What can we do? Those which we feel cannot be done, we are also trying to get other sectors come up with their also strategies which we can make together. You remember initially I said coordination is one of a challenge when it comes to those kind of sectors. I mentioned that, but we are much aware that we need a holistic approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Other questions from the audience? Ole, okay.
Thank you very much. Ole Zander from International Rice Research Institute. I have maybe one comment to the discussion and maybe mostly to our speaker from Senegal, and then one question probably to Owen. The comment is that you mentioned the low capacity of local institutions in terms of emissions management, also identification of options, and also the low level of investments that's happening in that area. And I've been working in Vietnam for more than 12 years now, and the shift, the huge step in capacity and capability and expertise that I've seen in Vietnam in 12 years is tremendous. I think it all started with universities and local research institutions that kind of developed the capacities, and that kind of trickled up towards national policymakers, decision makers, and mostly in that case in the Ministry of Agriculture actually, and now also becomes more mainstreamed in local policy and decision makers. So I think the investment, and that I would urge all our donors and investors to really invest in capacity building in developing countries, because only then you can identify these important win-win options, for example. Only then also the private sector has an idea where can we invest, what are meaningful and viable investments. So this capacity building is incredibly important, I think. And then one question to Owen. You mentioned the private sector, and we've always said, or several times mentioned the important role of the private sector. But they only go for profitable options. I mean, they go where the money is. If they don't see any return on investments, we will not see investment of the private sector, or very little in terms of some public relations outputs. So my question would be, what can we do to maybe reduce the risk or make investment options for the private sector more attractive? So what can be done to maybe limit that barrier for investments by the private sector?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, if I think of you're right. I mean, if I think of the barriers to private sector finance right now, you've got profitability, capacity, traceability, and generally the private sector is not the place to solve systems level questions, to your thinking earlier. But if you can legitimize and mobilize that finance, then that finance can be put to that purpose. And so I said earlier, there's really two, and I'm thinking of companies with value chains primarily here rather than big financial institutions for a second. Those companies generally will look to finance something if it's in their value chain. So is this within my footprint? If so, I need to reduce my footprint, and ergo I'll invest in it. The second is to take responsibility for your residual footprint. And in there, you've got some room for stuff that's maybe harder to reach. Because to your point, it's neither profitable to help those farmers, and it's not generally within anybody's supply chain because they're subsistence farmers. So it's not going to be in the first bucket, but it could be in the second of responsibility. So I think maybe on the first one, how to incentivize that, I think we need to break down the barriers that prevent companies from counting it. So it can be quite difficult in some supply chains to know who supplied you, and if you invest in them, maybe next year you switch suppliers to another region, all that benefit's lost to you because it's no longer in your footprint. So we need to find the sort of, unfortunately, quite technocratic solutions to help people account for the things that they do, and then I think the finance will flow to that. And there's a program that we're working on shortly with IRI that looks at that in the context of rice. I think then on the other side of the ledger, I've done all that, I've reduced my footprint, and I'm reducing my footprint in line with science. How do I take responsibility for what's left over? At the moment, I think most companies would probably work that out at the end of the year, go to the carbon market, see what's cheap, what's available, what I like the look of, and I'll buy those credits. I think what we should and can try to do now is make it such that pot of money goes to optimal investments. So to my mind, instead of, say, a big steel manufacturer going out and buying what's ever available, the steel sector should be somehow targeted and linked to the LTS. So I should buy credits, or I should finance things that are maybe about conservation and restoration of nature, that target the non-productive, in their eyes, part of the economy, because there's no other way to reach that through value chain investments. So at the moment, instead of, I feel like supporting some deforestation somewhere, we need some sort of legitimacy, some sort of guidance, which we hope to create next year, around what would be optimal for them to invest in. So I think on the value chain side of the ledger, it's all about breaking down barriers to traceability, segregation, and on the other side, the responsibility side, it's all about how can we legitimize what to finance, and then how can we bring all of that into line with the LTSs, I think.
Thank you. Caroline, investments. When you've been working on the LTSs with your partners, are you looking at how to finance them and how to even map out what would be required?
So, I mean, I think that's one of the gaps we see, because the LTS, I mean, it really looks at solutions, looks at where should you be investing in terms of where are the critical, maybe hotspots that you should be making that investment. So where should we be targeting those solutions, for instance, in the agriculture sector, if we have to make sure that the agriculture sector remains at a low emission trajectory. So which are the value chains? Where are the nodes in that value chain that are contributing to your emissions? And also having a long-term perspective. So you're looking at the 2050s and beyond. So it details all that at country level. But the gap is now, how do you take that in terms of asking what's the resources that's required? What should those specific areas of that financing go to? And I think that's the next step. And one of the gaps also we see is that the LTS as a public, more or less focus, because it's linked to the UNFCCC process, which for me, I think sometimes it's a public, it's led by national governments, it tends to have a focus more on the role of the public sector, rather than how then do we bring the financing in the roadmap, where who is going to contribute. And what he's saying is very relevant. Sometimes you need the catalyst from public sector to be able to de-risk. And through de-risking, then you can attract the private sector. So I think that's the next level of investment roadmap development for me. I think that's what the countries need to do, is to carry that and look at those roadmaps for investing. And another area where we're seeing is that also there's ballpoint figures, of course, that through the modeling, some of the economic modeling in the LTSs could have a very high level picture of the resources needed. But we really need to go down in terms of how are we going to mobilize the resource mobilization approach. So we have a big picture, how we are accumulating the 50 billion that we need by 2050 for Africa. It's really very granular how we add up the numbers. But if you ask exactly the resource mobilization approach, and if you give me that 50 billion, exactly where it's going, and what's the incremental benefit, the marginal benefit of each dollar in those nodes of the value chain, that's missing. I think we need to really go to that level of detail. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think these are very important. And the other challenge, particularly, I always speak for Africa. The other challenge is when we say emissions, it's many things. It's not only CO2. We have other gases. We have methane. We have NOx. And the knowledge on those greenhouse gases is absolutely minimal. Because first of all, the activity data is missing. You don't know how much of cows we have. We don't have the emission factor. We just do approximations. We really don't know, basically, how much we emit. The second point, which might be interested, is how to link the low emission with emerging development challenge, such as air pollution and health in our cities. There's a lot of peri-urban agriculture, a lot of water table which is being polluted because of some practice of agriculture. And without connecting these dots in the priorities for development, it will be very difficult to persuade our decision makers of the relevance of pursuing low emission. They will think it's a fancy word, another buzzword that comes from Europe, the Western countries, then which is not related to our realities. But in fact, there's a lot of connections with the daily life and livelihood of people, and we should make that connection.
Thank you. Okay, Freddie, I want to come to you. We're hearing about the low emissions part of the long-term strategies. I remember when we started the work in Uganda, we got the first draft from the person who wrote it, and it said there, low emissions, climate resilient, long-term. We said, no, no, no. That climate resilient part should come first. Then the low emissions part can come. Can you talk a little bit about why that was the case and how in Uganda you've been thinking about in 2050, where do we want to be and what's important for the country?
Thank you very much. You have actually reminded me. And my brother here has already said that we have a problem of data, name it. But all in all, we try in our settings to get whatever data we can. Now, getting back to your question, we looked at scenarios, actually, in this strategy of the long-term strategy for agriculture. What will happen? Because we said we want political support also, but at the same time, we want our people to understand that if we leave our situation the way it is, things may get worse. Uganda at the moment is ranked as one of those countries with low emissions. But according to the studies in the country, we see increases of emissions. Now we are starting at 50% within the country context. And much of those emissions are coming from agriculture. 30% is coming from agriculture. So the situation analysis we made, that is what we found. But at global level, Uganda is ranked as one of those with low emissions. But at the same time, it is ranked as the 49th country which is ill-prepared. And Uganda is an agrarian economy. We depend on agriculture. And agriculture is one of the most vulnerable areas or sectors to climate change. So what have we done is to look at the present situation and be able to project what might happen given the scenario that we have started emitting. So we identified 4 areas within the agricultural sector which are emitting. And one of them was the enteric fermentation, that is from livestock. And then the poor manure management, still from the livestock. Then we have those emissions of nitrous oxide from the soils. And then invading the organic soils. That's where we look at wetlands generally. And that one is actually becoming a broader area as we search for growing rice, paddy rice. So we are invading organic soils. So given all that scenario, given the fact that Uganda is an agrarian economy, we cannot sit and wait. So in the development of this long-term strategy, we have looked at scenarios. A situation where you leave business as usual. And then a situation where you take action. Then within taking action, we have looked also two scenarios. Taking stringent measures and moderate measures. And then we look at implications. What is possible? And what is likely to happen to climate change when we look at climate and rainfall pattern? What will it look like in the 50 years to come? How will our farmers survive? How will the economy survive? So, through modeling, we realized that something has to be done. If it is stringent, then people have to take immediate measures, some of which may not be very possible. And if we leave it as business as usual, we shall, at the end of the day, or in 50 years, we shall have extreme temperatures, changed rainfall patterns, and then land suitability will have changed by that time. And probably the available land to crop growing will have reduced because of floods. Floods, by the way, is one of the common phenomena these days in the country, and landslides. I'm sure some of you have been watching TV. You normally see those kind of scenarios simply because our people have invaded even hill areas. But suffice to say that even drought is one of the areas. And within the country now, we have what we call the cattle corridor, which we know is always dry and suffers a lot of drought events. So given all those scenarios, we came up with that long-term strategy, still under development, but we are moving forward. Look at different scenarios and their implications. So I don't know if you want me to add on, but that is where we are. How do we move? The path is, let's go with a moderate scenario, but which will lead us to the promised land. Because if we take stringent measures, very abrupt, farmers cannot cope. And if we leave business as usual, we are likely to have a catastrophe in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I want to just close with asking the panelists to summarize in 1 or 2 minutes. Looking forward, other countries still need to create these long-term strategies. What's one piece of advice you would give them on how to go about this, and something that so far you've learned from your experience or you think really is crucial to consider? So let's start with Caroline.
So one of the things I would want to emphasize to the countries is the value of those documents. One of the things we see is a slow pace in terms of taking on these processes. But I want to emphasize there's a value. One of the value I see is that we want a country to have quantifiable and time-bound targets. You know, you need to look at where are we at every point and be able to resonate and ask whether we are keeping to where we want to be. So I think that's one of the takes that I would want to emphasize as a value for the countries. And then at the outset, these, for instance, the LTS is not just about mitigation, but it's really about integrating from the beginning, integration of mitigation and adaptation so that you can achieve also the core benefits. So it's for me also a process to move beyond just, NDCs which are more mitigation focused to really look at, especially for Africa, our greatest challenge and priority on adaptation. So this helps us to really bring this home, bring the whole conversation on climate change home. Because for us, home is adaptation. Yes, I think for me, that's what I would want to emphasize.
Yeah, I think from the private sector side, I think I just emphasize that the private sector faces many of the same challenges articulated by countries, and so I think the logical next steps involve integrating those voluntary incentives into paying for, supporting paying for the national ones. The one thing I thought I would reflect on quickly was what Ole was saying about the need to support capacity building and institution building. At the moment, as I say, the voluntary space is quite a blunt instrument, i.e. I have this many emissions, I'm going to go and find this many carbon credits and I'm done. That's nice and easy. What I think we'll do at Gold Standard, and we can support from civil society side, is to legitimize that maybe it's best not to offset, maybe you should use that money to support capacity building, and that would have a much bigger amplifying effect, even if it's difficult to quantify right now. And so I think it's legitimizing stuff that's maybe not as transactional and simple, but is more important to finance. So yeah, we'll just say the private sector sees similar issues, wants to support, has a lot of barriers that needs to be unlocked as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to add to that what I heard from Uganda experience and the Senegal experience, long-term strategy is a context-specific approach. Even within a country, I think we should think of having more granularity. So I'm sure Uganda is like Senegal. From one place to another, the low emission pathway will be different. From dry land to humid, the low emission pathway will be different. Because local aspirations are not the same. Local practice are not the same. Having a national strategy on LTS does not always help address the bottom-up approach where community aspirations are differentiated and where local practices are differentiated. The second take-home message is we talk a lot about data, and we all know that Paris Agreement Article 6 talk about MRV. MRV not only for monitoring greenhouse gas, but MRV for the financial resources that are mobilized in each country to address low emissions. You can count on the tip of your fingers how many countries in Africa have their own MRV for the Paris Agreement. There are not many. I did the one in Haiti, and there is no such a framework in these countries to accommodate data collection from different institutions to document the low emission pathway. There is none. It's a very serious issue. And finally, that's what Emily just said, the nesting approach between adaptation and mitigation, but make sure that the entry point is adaptation because that's where the priorities are. These are the few take-home messages I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Probably I would like to thank, we've been receiving technical support, definitely, because to have all those projections, the data is talking about, he has already said that we have shortage of data normally. So we have received technical guidance and support from ILILI, that's International Livestock Research Institute, and FAO, and Agnes. So we want to thank you so much, really, for the technical support and financial support you have accorded to us to be where we are. I want to assure you that we shall be there soon. We have made the consultations with the beneficiaries, which is very important, especially the farmers. We want to hear from them. We want to know what they are doing. We want to share with them what they are going through. Come together and see how best they want us to work with them so that they can overcome the situation in which they are. And also, thank you people who have come to listen to us. We hope that we shall have networks, and this is the beginning and will not be the end. So we thank you so much. We got encouraged when we saw you amid the stars, and when we got questions, They have added on to what we knew, and we would like to improve on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Freddie. And let me also thank everybody for coming. We were competing with something else very exciting over there. Maybe we were not so exciting in here, but it was a really important topic. So thank you all for staying. Thank you to the panelists for all of your insights. I think we really have learned a lot. I have some notes to summarize, but we're at 3:30, so I'll let you all go. Thank you again for coming, and take care.